Nicholas,
Hello.
thank you for inviting me, for spending the time with me.
Oh, thank you very much for asking to come and have a chat with me. It's lovely to meet you, Ben.
Have you ever tried to meet David?
Ever tried to meet him? Well, I never did actually get to meet David. I was in the front row of many a David Bowie concert, but he did know about my book. He was aware of it, and we were sort of in touch, if that's the right phrase. And I'm delighted to say he was always very, very kind and very supportive of the book, which has been around for quite a long time now. The first edition came out in 2000, so I'm talking to you now in 2023. So it's been in print over several different editions. I think 7 updates, 7 editions for 23 years, which is I guess that's not bad going, is it? And anyway, over the years, whenever there was a new edition of the book, the publisher and I would, parcel up half a dozen copies and send them over to New York because David's people always sort of asked for some. And every time, without any request on my part, David, bless him, would write a lovely little inscription in one of those copies and send it back to me. So I've got a little collection of those, and as you can imagine, they're among my most prized possessions. So yeah, he wrote sweet little things in there, and he was very, as I say, very kind and very supportive about the book. But no, I never actually met him. Do you know, maybe that's for the best, because I would probably have just been, I probably wouldn't have been able to string a sentence together.
And have you ever tried to?
Did I ever try to meet him? Well, oh yes, sorry, that was actually your question, wasn't it? No, do you know, I didn't really. I never attempted to engineer a meeting. I'm a big fan, obviously, as you know, but I've never been one of those people who I feel very silly hanging around at the stage door to meet someone afterwards, or that sort of thing. I've never really done that. Maybe it's because in another part of my life, when I'm not writing books about David Bowie, I'm actually an actor myself, and maybe it's something to do with that. Stage door is a place where you go in and out for work. Hanging around at other people's stage door. Maybe it's something, I don't know. But no, I always feel a bit sort of foolish doing that. So no, I'm never I'm not a backstage ligger. Never have been.
What was your entry song?
My entry song for David Bowie? Well, the first one I think I can remember hearing at all, that I was aware was this guy, David Bowie, would have been Rebel Rebel in 1974. I'm just a little bit too young. I know it doesn't look like it now, but I am just a little bit too young to have been there for the whole Ziggy, Starman on Top of the Pops. I don't remember that. But by the time Rebel Rebel came along, I suppose I would have been 6 or 7 years old at that point, and that's the first one I can remember. But it was just another pop song. Really, I quite liked it, but I was 7. The first record that I actually went out and bought with my own pocket money was about 3 years later was Sound and Vision by David Bowie. So that was kind of my entry song. But then kind of going on from that was, I loved that song and I played that record over and over again. I remember, but it was still kind of a one-off. I hadn't entered the world of David Bowie then. I think the real moment for me was when I saw him performing Boys Keep Swinging, again a couple of years later, 1979, on the Kenny Everett show, which was, a big show in Britain at the time. And he came on and performed his new single, Boys Keep Swinging. And that was the moment where I really went, I love this guy.
Okay, great. How many concerts have you seen?
How many? Oh, do you know? I'd have to count them up. I mean, it's not hundreds. It's probably a couple of dozen. I was actually quite a late starter to going to concerts, just generally. I went to see a few when I was a kid. My parents took me to see people and things. But I didn't really start going to gigs, under my own steam with my mates until I was well into my late teens. People will be shocked by this, I expect, but I didn't see David Bowie live until 1989. Tin Machine, the first Tin Machine tour was the first time I saw him, St George's Hall in Bradford, and it was a great concert. I still remember it as being one of the loudest concerts I've ever been to. It was deafening, and it was great. And then after that, I saw him many, many times on the Sound and Vision tour and the Outside tour, all the tours that came after, and Heathen and Reality and so on. So I don't know. I'd have to go and count them up, but I'm guessing probably a couple of dozen, maybe 30. I don't know, something like that. And among them, I was lucky to be at some really special ones. You know, Hammersmith in 2002, one of the longest gigs he ever played, with some amazing songs in there. You know, he sang the Bewley Brothers that night. That was a very special evening. And I was lucky enough to be at the Riverside Studios when he first premiered the Reality album, the one that got shown around cinemas, it was live cast to cinemas, and I was actually in the audience there for that. In fact, there's a video of it, and if you look very carefully, you can see my silly bald head bouncing around in a couple of songs. Yeah, happy times.
Is there a best, a worst concert you remember?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm always terrible on best and worst and favourite, because I always end up thinking of half a dozen, which isn't what you want to know what the best is. I mean, look, I'll choose one now and then I'll change my mind in 5 minutes. But one of the best concerts I saw Bowie give, I maintain, was the Outside tour in 1995, which I saw two or three times in London at Wembley. That's the first place I saw it. And it was just such a thrilling show. I mean, the band were fantastic for a start. And of course, famously at that point, he was taking a step back from the greatest hits. And it was all, based around his new album at the time, Outside. But also, the oldies that he was playing on that tour were largely sort of deep cuts, as we say, quite obscure songs like Teenage Wildlife and... he sang Boys Keep Swinging, actually, on that tour for the first time. He'd never really done it in concert before. He'd done a couple of TV spots doing it, but he'd never done it in a tour before. And Andy Warhol and things like that. And then a reimagined version of The Man Who Sold the World, done as this kind of strange trip-hop thing. I just thought it was a fantastic show. And he was clearly really committed to it as well. He was really believed in what he was doing, as he always did. But I thought that was a really special show. And the band was absolutely hot. And you wanted to know worst as well. I haven't got a worst. I never saw one that I never went away disappointed. Honestly, I can't. No, they were all great.
Great. In 2025, the V&A Museum will show Bowie items. Mm-hmm. Tell it in my words.
Yes.
Do you have your ticket yet?
I haven't got my ticket yet, but as soon as they become available, I shall be queuing up. Yeah, that's exciting, isn't it? I was very fortunate to be a little bit involved in the V&A Museum exhibition a few years ago. David Bowie is the big museum that started at the V&A in London and then toured around various places around the world. And the curators of that exhibition, Geoffrey Marsh and Victoria Brokes, got in touch with me, as they did with lots of other people. It wasn't just me, and asked me to sort of help out a little bit, and I came in and we had a few meetings and I suggested a few things, but it was very much their show, and it was a fantastic, brilliant job that they did. But it was lovely to be a little part of that. So I had the great joy of going along to the opening night of it, where they had the red carpet out and all the famous people were there. It was all very exciting, and me, there's someone, there's people kind of timing you up the red carpet, because all the paparazzi, all the photographers were there, So obviously they'd say, right, next person, and Noel Gallagher goes up and his cameras going off, and then Mark Almond goes up, cameras go off, and then Nick, your turn, and I go up with my partner. And they're all going, I'll just check my camera now. Who's that? But of course, I'm not famous. But it was a real lesson in humiliation. But actually, an actor friend of ours was there as well, Matt Smith, who at the time was Doctor Who. He was playing Doctor Who. And my partner Barnaby and I work in Doctor Who as well. So we know Matt very well, and he happened to go up the red carpet just in front of us, actually. So he got all the cameras, and then we went up, and then we got to the top, and he turned around and went, Nick, Barnaby, and gave us a big hug. So we thought, there you are, you see, look, Doctor Who knows who we are. That was great. It was a lovely, lovely evening and a great exhibition. Great. So yeah, very much looking forward to seeing the new, installation of David Bowie's archive in London. That's very exciting.
We'll meet there.
Yeah, definitely.
Your wonderful book must have given you an insane amount of work. Why did you do it?
Do you know, I often ask myself that. Why did I do it? Well, obviously, by the time I started working on it, I was a full-blown David Bowie fan. And I'd read quite a few books, about him. There were a lot of biographies around. Some of them were very good. Some of them maybe not quite so good. But what there wasn't was a book which looked at his music, his work, and not just his music, his films, his acting work, his videos, his art, and, the whole sort of everything that he did, was he moved through so many different disciplines in the arts, and I was fascinated by all of it. And of course, this was also, when I first started writing it, it was in the late 90s, which was a time when actually David Bowie was not, a lot of people had written him off. The music critics were sort of laughing at him a bit, and around about the time of albums like Outside and Earthling, which I loved. And I wanted there to be a book which gave as much due and credit and consideration to what was then his new work as to his old stuff. Nearly all of the books I'd read sort of got about as far as Scary Monsters and then sort of hit the accelerator. The rest of it is just... And I didn't agree with that. I wanted to look... And the 1980s, I think, is a fascinating decade of Bowie, which, again, a lot of people write off. So, anyway, rather pompously, I thought to myself, well, if no one else is going to write that book, I'll have a go. And if I had the faintest idea when I started how long it was going to take, I may well not have started, because it's like when you cook some rice and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you've put too much in, so you have to put some more water in, and then you put some more, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And what I had originally foolishly thought might be just a little book, ended up being this gigantic book, longer than War and Peace, apparently. My editor told me this, and the last edition officially got, the word count is now higher than War and Peace by Tolstoy, which, as you know, is the sort of agreed SI unit of long book. So yeah, it took a really long time. The first edition took me over a year, certainly, to write, pretty much as a daily job. Well, in between acting jobs. I can remember writing bits and bobs of it in dressing rooms while I was on tour with a play at the time. So it's a real labour of love, and every now and then, of course, I've had to update it and so on. So that takes quite a long time as well. Every time I do a new edition, it usually takes another maybe 3 or 4 months just to bring it up to date, because, of course, it's in the nature of the book, because it's not chronological, it's sort of encyclopedic, so I can't just stick another chapter on the end, leave the rest as it is. I've got to sort of pull the whole thing apart and add bits in the middle and rewrite bits, and a new discovery has been made, or a bit of film has been found that was lost, like when the Gene Genie Top of the Pops appearance was rediscovered. I had to put that in the right place in the book, so I had to completely pull apart the entry on the Gene Genie and rewrite it. So it's every time I revise the book, it's quite a big task. So in answer to your question, God knows why I did it. But it's too late to stop now.
Okay. Now comes a tough question.
Yeah?
You are engaged in AIDS charity, you are gay, and you are a Bowie fan. Is there a connection between these three topics?
Well, David Bowie obviously was a really key figure in LGBTQ plus history. Not that it was called that back in 1972, but when he first proclaimed himself bisexual and appeared on Top of the Pops performing Starman, it was a seismic moment for popular culture. It meant a huge amount to an awful lot of people, and he kicked down doors and opened up, shone a light into some dark corners and made life an awful lot better for a lot of gay kids. And so obviously he's an important role model in that respect. He was also a great campaigner for charitable causes. He wasn't one of those people who sort of went on about it a lot, but he donated very generously to charities, and one of the charities he did support was the Terence Higgins Trust. And yes, I have done a little bit of work for them, actually with a David Bowie connection, because every year there's an evening in London in the summer. The last few years it's been at the wonderful venue near King's Cross called the Water Rats, which is an evening of music and events commemorating David Bowie, and it's all in aid of the Terence Higgins Trust. And they have usually an auction of memorabilia and signed items, and people donate things, and musicians who worked with David come along and play a little set and do a little talk, and it's a great little evening. And over the years, the Bowie fans at that event have raised many thousands of pounds for the Terence Higgins Trust. So it's really humbling to see that in praise. So yeah, it is all. I think it is all connected. Yeah, and I'm very. I consider it a privilege to be able to help out a little bit in that, because as you say, I'm gay myself. I'm of the age that came of age and grew up as a young teenager and a young man during the sort of darkest period of the AIDS epidemic. And, you know, I was lucky to make it through. I knew people who weren't that lucky. And, you know, as young people, we sat at a few bedsides and went to a few funerals that we shouldn't have had to go to. So I don't, you know, that we must never forget that story, and the fact that the Terence Higgins Trust and charities like that are still doing vitally important work. Things have got a lot better, of course they have, but there's still an awful lot of work to do. It's I think it's important to, you know, do a little bit if you can. And yeah, Bowie is a, you know, he would never have wanted himself to be a figurehead for any sort of movement. He wasn't like that. He was, you know, I think that if he was a figurehead for anything, he was a figurehead for the lack of figureheads, for being your own person, being individual. You know, and that was what he championed. But of course, he was a tremendously important figure in that particular narrative. You know, the youngsters who saw David Bowie in 1972 went to the Ziggy Stardust tour. You know, there's a whole generation of fans who saw that, who, you know, some of them just people who went about their normal lives and were enriched by it, but there were so many people in the audience of those concerts who ended up being in, you know, the next generation of pop stars. In the early 1980s, there was this sort of sudden groundswell of representation, as we say these days. When groups like Soft Cell and Bronski Beat and the Communards, a bit later on, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, the Pet Shop Boys, all of those people were in the audience of the Ziggy Stardust concerts, and, you know, it made such a difference. And so he kind of, you know, he liberated that side of popular culture enormously. So yeah, I don't think we can overstate the importance of what he did there.
Thank you. Last night you talked about the 3 performances in 1968 here in Moresby.
Yeah.
Why the specific interest in such a small moment in Bowie's history, or is it that you are interested in everything about the man?
Well, I am interested in everything about the man, I suppose. But, I mean, the fascinating thing about Bowie, and I was saying this last night in the little talk that I gave, is that nothing that he ever did went to waste. You know, you can home in on any little episode in his career, whether it be early on or in the middle or later on, and it's going to be fascinating, because it'll be a little moment in, you know, his creative pursuit, which, and I mean, that's the thing, I was saying it earlier on, wasn't I, that whatever David Bowie did, he absolutely threw himself into it in that moment. He believed in it passionately, and, you know, then he got enthused about something else and moved on, and that was great, because that was his way. That was in the nature of his character, that, you know, he had a famously short attention span. You know, he was massively into this thing, and then suddenly, whoosh, can't see that anymore, I'm onto something new. And that's what made him so special, really. But yeah, this particular thing, when he came to the Rosehill Theatre in 1968 with Lindsay Kemp's company, performing this show Piero in Turquoise, which he had devised with Lindsay, is a tremendously important moment in his career, because Lindsay Kemp, who was a few years older than him, David was 20 when they came here, Lindsay Kemp was 29, so, you know, but Lindsay taught David a huge amount about theatre craft. Obviously, he taught him the specifics of, you know, Lindsay Kemp was a mime and dance artist, and he taught David a lot about that, but he also just taught him about, you know, the importance of lighting and what you can do with, you know, how to make an entrance, how to you know, the sort of theatricality of putting on a show, which is something that David became tremendously good at thereafter. You know, a lot of rock stars and bands, you know, when you go and see a gig, they just kind of come on with their guitars, don't they, and go, oh, good evening, right, here's our first song. David Bowie was never like that. He made an entrance. It wasn't necessarily, you know, it wasn't like Spinal Tap or anything. I mean, sometimes he did go wildly over the top, you know, famously on his Glass Spider tour in 1987, he descended from the stage in a chair singing into a telephone. And I mean, it's great, I love it. But yeah, even if he just walked on stage, he managed to do it in a fabulously theatrical way, and that's something that Lindsay Kemp taught him. You know, what you can do with movement and what you can do with stillness as well. So Lindsay was tremendously significant. He arrived in David's life at a moment in his career when he really benefited from having someone who just showed him, he had talent. He was already he released his first album. He was a good songwriter. He was very ambitious. He was very good looking. He was, but he needed someone to just knock him into shape a little bit about how to present himself on stage. And I think that's the extraordinary contribution that Lindsay Kemp gave. And they stayed very good friends afterwards, of course. And once David had become very successful, the Ziggy Stardust period, he called up Lindsay to come and choreograph and take part in a big Ziggy Stardust show that he did in the summer of '72. So they stayed good friends, and it was a great moment, and lovely to be able to come here and stand on the very stage of this tiny little theatre where they performed 55 years ago now, and talk about it a bit. Yeah.
Nick, you are an actor, Doctor Who, for example, a writer, a very active political commentator,
Gosh,
at least on Twitter, a music producer, decades, for example, an advisor, last 5 years. You even worked on the David Bowie Is exhibition. There can't be much time left, or? Yeah.
What, to do other stuff, you mean? Well, I try and carve out a little bit of spare time to do other things. But gosh, you say it like that. It makes it sound as though I'm tremendously busy all day long, every day. But I manage to do a bit of gardening, which I enjoy, and cooking, go for walks, read books. But yeah, sometimes I'm very busy doing stuff. But I guess it's good to stay busy, isn't it? Good to find something to do. But no, I actually love relaxing pursuits. I'm a very keen gardener. I love my garden. I have a little garden, but I lavish a lot of time and attention on that. Although I say relaxing, it's not relaxing when you're digging out weeds and trying to get these brambles out and things. But no, I do love it. My father was a great gardener, and I think he passed that on to me. And so that's something I do in my spare time. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a regular job?
A regular job? Well, no, not really. As in, sort of going into an office and doing something. No. I'm a writer and I'm an actor and I'm occasionally a theatre director and that sort of thing. And when I'm not doing those things, I'm gardening. No, I don't have a sort of 9-to-5 job. The things I do aren't hobbies. They are what I do my best to earn a crust with. Yeah.
Okay. You always appear composed and eloquent when you interview famous musicians.
Do I? Oh, good.
Yeah. I've seen the a long interview with Tony Visconti you made.
Oh,
with
yeah.
2 screens.
Yes, that was during the pandemic. It was the Dublin Bowie Festival, which happens, every year. This was 2021, wasn't it? So it was the first kind of new year of the pandemic, the first just after Christmas. So yeah, obviously they couldn't hold the festival in reality, so they held it online instead. And I'd been to the Dublin Bowie Festival before, a couple of years before, as a guest, and they got in touch with me and asked me if I would do some of the online stuff. So yeah, one of the things we did was it was a live streamed interview with Tony Visconti, and then of course they recorded it and they've put it up online. So yeah, that was great fun. I know Tony quite well. We've met a few times over the years, and he's been a huge help with my book. Yeah. Tony, he's a wonderful guy, and he's been so generous with his time. So yeah, it was. We enjoyed ourselves. We had a chat, talking through Tony's career with David. It was quite, as you say, quite a long interview. I think it was about an hour and a half, wasn't it? But even with it, Tony did so much work with David over such a long period of time. 1967 they first met, and they worked together on many albums and recordings right up until Black Star, Bowie's last album. So even in 90 minutes, we barely scratched the surface. We just chose a few songs between us. Tony chose some of his favourite ones that he'd done with David, and I suggested a few as well. And we just sort of hopped from one album to another, saying, on this album we'll just talk about this song as an example. And it seemed to work quite well, yeah.
My next question is about Tony. 1977, the album Low came out. And in the charts, I've looked in the internet, were ABBA with Money, 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 Smokey, Living Next Door to Alice, Julie Covington with Don't Cry For Me, Argentina, Steve Miller Band, Fly Like an Eagle, or Eagles with Hotel California. And in the same year, David Bowie with Low.
Yeah.
I remember hearing Sound and Vision on the radio. That was my entry song also.
Oh, right, yeah.
I was 13, and it was like music from another planet.
Yeah.
How important was Tony for David?
How important was Tony for David? I think Tony was extremely important for David. One of the important things was that they were very good friends. They bonded at a very, they were both very young when they met each other, roughly the same age. I think Tony's a tiny bit older than David, I think. Forgive me, Tony, if I've got that the wrong way around, but I think, yeah. But they were basically both in their very early 20s when they met. And they became very good friends, and they just had this instinctive, they knew what one another were sort of thinking. David just had to say, Tony, can you give it a bit of more of a something, and Tony knew what he, and that's really important with a producer. If you've got that communication, that each one knows what the other can provide and each one knows what the other one wants. It's an incredibly, that's the basis of an excellent relationship between an artist and a producer. So there was that, but there's also the fact that Tony, as a producer, he has many great talents. I mean, famously, one of his talents is his wonderful orchestral arrangements, his string arrangements, which he worked with Mark Bolan as well, of course, famously did some beautiful string arrangements on some of Mark's songs and on many of Bowie's as well. So there's that, and he was a great bass player as well, a very fine musician in his own right. He plays bass on a lot of Bowie recordings. But as a producer, another great talent I think that Tony has is that he knows when not to add stuff. He's a very good sort of declutterer. He creates a sort of spaciousness which is, to the benefit of the music. And I think that's a very good relationship that he had with David, because David himself said, his instinct was sometimes to pile on everything. Let's add a saxophone, let's add a choir, let's have put a Peruvian nose flute. And Tony would be the one who said, hang on a minute, no, what does it sound like if we just have the drums on this bit, or whatever, that sort of thing. And I think that was a very good sort of duet. So I think Tony was tremendously important, and specifically on the Berlin albums, Low and Heroes. They were all being, that part of the point of that period for David, part of the point of that period for David was specifically to try something new, to go out on a limb and do something experimental, because he'd sort of got tired of his young American station to station, that sort of Los Angeles phase, which had been very successful for him commercially, but he was wary of becoming an established artist and ending up in a particular sort of rut. And that, of course, was David's great genius. He knew when it was time to jump off the conveyor belt and do something new. And Low really was a step off the brink. So Tony tells this story that, David rang him up and said, right, Brian Eno and I are going to work on a new album, and can you come and what can you bring to the table? We're going to do some crazy stuff. What can you contribute? And Tony had just got hold of this new gadget called the Eventide Harmonizer. So he told David about that, and this is down the phone apparently, and David said, what does that do? And Tony famously said, apparently he said down the phone, it fucks with the fabric of time. And David said, bring it! And that's and that which Tony brought along, that machine is fundamental to the sound of Low. That's what they used to create that extraordinary drum sound, which has now become a kind of commonplace. But when Low came out, no one had heard that before. That extraordinary... Brian Eno explains it very well, better than I will, but I'll try. It does fuck with the fabric of time, because you record someone hitting a drum, and then you can, with the harmonizer, you can stretch it out. So instead of boom, you get boom, 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 like that, and then you kind of push it back together again, and it sort of goes zoom, like that. And so those kind of weird drum beats at the beginning of Sound and Vision, boom. No one had heard that noise before, and it's revolutionary. So that was Tony. Tony brought that machine along and got that going. So. Yeah, can't be underestimated. And it's such a great album. Amazing album. So I'm glad Sound and Vision was your entry song too. Yeah.
My friend Gunnar sent me an audio file years ago. Mm-hmm. David Bowie impersonates. Do you know that?
Is this the Absolute Beginners thing where he's doing... Yeah, that's incredible, isn't it? That is absolutely incredible. I've spoken to the guy who recorded that. It was when they were recording the song Absolute Beginners, and it was in London. They were working, and the producers were Langer and Winstanley, the people who did a lot of hits with Madness and people like that. They were the music directors on the Absolute Beginners film. They did all of the soundtrack recordings for that, including David's songs. And anyway, one evening in the studio when David was working on his vocal, he just sort of started riffing and doing this funny thing and started doing impersonations. And the engineer who was there thought, this is too good to miss, and he slipped a cassette in and started recording it. You can hear on the thing they're kind of requesting, say, oh, do Lou Reed next, and so do Iggy Pop, do that. And he was such a brilliant mimic, David. An uncannily good mimic. And he used to love, you see him on chat shows, and he will drop into an impersonation of Mick Jagger or John Gielgud or whoever, and he's brilliant at it. Lindsay Kemp, actually, this is something I mentioned in the talk last night. Lindsay Kemp remembered that on his very first meeting with David, they talked about their mutual love of old silent movies and comedy and old films and things. And David impressed Lindsay with a brilliant impersonation of Stan Laurel, apparently, at the age of 20 or whatever he was at the time. That Absolute Beginners tape is really, really special. And then the guy, he didn't, release it, put it out, try to make money out of it or anything. He sat on it dutifully for however many years it was. And then after David Bowie sadly died, I think he thought, right, people need to hear this because it's so wonderful, and he popped it onto the internet, and it's become a bit of a legend now, and it's fantastic, isn't it? He does Neil Young, he does Lou, he does Iggy, he does who else does he do? All sorts of Bruce Springsteen. It's great, and it's the same little verse that he just sings in all these different styles. His Iggy Pop impersonation is uncannily good. It's incredible, and you do occasionally hear it on his proper songs. Bowie, he would sometimes kind of semi-impersonate someone. It was a long time before I realised that another song on Low, Always Crashing in the Same Car. It's not an impersonation, but it kind of is Bob Dylan. He's kind of doing it in the way that Bob Dylan might sing a David Bowie song. And Brian Eno has said apparently that there was another take where he just went totally silly Bob Dylan on it. And they were all going, that's amazing. That sounds exactly. They thought it was too silly, not going to do that. We'll pull back a bit. But he is kind of doing it. And there are other songs, Janine, the song on the Space Oddity album, he's kind of doing Elvis. Janine. He impersonates Mark Bolan a couple of times. That sort of Mark Bolan did that famous sort of bleating noise that he used to do. Bowie pops that in a couple of songs. He does it in Black Country Rock on the Man Who Sold the World album. He suddenly goes into a sort of Mark Bolan noise at one point. He quite consciously did these things. Yeah.
Great. Where were you when the news came of David's death?
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that everyone remembers where they were, don't they? Well, I was in bed. I normally leave my mobile phone, in another room, but for some reason that night I had it by my bedside, and at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning UK time, that very sad morning, my phone started going. It was on silent, but it was vibrating, and it was just going, and it was doing it so much that I eventually woke up, and there were like 25 messages from people saying, what's this all about? And this was before the news had been on the radio or anything, but someone had heard, and I just thought, what's going on? Because his album had just come out. Don't be ridiculous, because I didn't know any more than anybody else about the fact that he'd been ill. I had no idea. That's how I heard, and then so I frantically did some messaging around and calling people and going, what's this? Have you heard anything? And people, messages were flying back and forth, and no one was quite sure if it was true. And then, it was Duncan, wasn't it, David's son, who eventually, at some point posted on Twitter, I'm sorry to say it's true what you're hearing. And, from that point on, we all knew. And then that day I just sat at home and kind of listened to the news on the radio and watched it on the TV. I got a lot of people getting in touch with me that, I don't want to sound, grand about it or anything, but a lot of that day for me was spent politely turning down requests to do interviews on the TV and on the radio and things. I mean, lots and lots and lots. I stopped counting when it passed 100. But I couldn't do it. I didn't want to, there was enough hot air going on. Everyone was doing their David Bowie tributes, and that's fine, of course, I understand it. But I was, as you can imagine, I was very upset, and the world does not need me to go on the radio and be upset. So I'm just going to sit this one out, I'm afraid. So I posted a little tribute of my own on Twitter and so on, and then I just sort of shut my trap, and then, in due course, was able to do some sort of slightly more substantial tribute stuff. But on that day, I just, it was a very sad day, wasn't it? Yeah.
These days, David is more popular than ever. My forecast, one generation further and David's popularity fades. What do you think?
Oh, do you think? I don't agree about that. I think that David's popularity will endure, and I think it will endure, long after we're all gone. Of course, I don't know. It's only a guess. But there are, since time immemorial, in popular culture, there are the people who survive and the people who don't, and the people who are huge at the time are often forgotten. There was a novelist in the 19th century, an English novelist called Edward Bulwer Lytton, who Bowie actually referenced in Oh You Pretty Things. But anyway, he was bigger than Charles Dickens. He outsold Charles Dickens 10-1. Dickens, in fact, knew him, and Bulwer Lytton was so successful that Dickens actually asked for his advice on how he should end Great Expectations, one of his most famous novels. Who's heard of Edward Bulwer Lytton now? Well, I have, because David Bowie references him in Oh You Pretty Things. But anyway, but the point is, he was massive in his day. But now we know Charles Dickens, we know the Brontes, and so on. And so it's not set in stone that someone who's incredibly successful and famous in their lifetime is going to endure. Not every artist does that. And some artists come in and out of fashion as well. There was a century or more when William Shakespeare was, forgotten. He was rehabilitated by the Romantics. And before that, he'd been regarded as this rather primitive writer who we don't talk about anymore. And then suddenly people realise he's a genius, and now he's installed as the greatest writer of English literature in our language. Anyway, my point is, I think personally that David Bowie is one of those whose work will endure, because I think the quality and beauty and profundity of it is something that that will out. And I think there are lots of other bands and recording artists who I admire enormously, and I think are great, but I can't quite believe that they'll last forever. But I think there are some who will, and I think David Bowie is one of them. I really do. I think 200 years from now, people are still going to know about David Bowie and be listening to him.
Okay. What do you think about the possibility of a David Bowie avatar concert, like ABBA did? Yeah,
wow. Well, I mean, I haven't seen the ABBA show yet. I want to see it, actually. I haven't got around to it. I love ABBA, I like me a bit of ABBA. I mean, it's been a huge hit, hasn't it, the ABBA show? It's been a huge success. It's been critically lauded, and obviously there will be people looking at it with a view to, now then, we can do, I'm sure that given some time, there'll be an Elvis show and there'll be a, whatever. So, of course, it's a possibility, isn't it? I mean, I believe it cost a fortune to get it up and running, But ABBA, of course, I'm sure they'll make their money back because they are massive, and quite rightly. So I don't know. I mean, of course, it will also depend on whether the Bowie estate wants to be involved in such a thing. I don't know really. I mean, it could happen, couldn't it? I'm sure, whatever the case, whether there's a Bowie one, I'm quite sure that ABBA won't be the only. There'll be more of these. I'm quite sure, because it's obviously been a big success. So it's going to become a thing, isn't it? Whether it's a Bowie thing, well, I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, so I'm through with my questions on you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bert.
I have 3 greetings for you.
Oh, yeah.
First of all is the dear Paul Kinder.
Oh, yes.
You know him?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yeah. The second one is my friend Nigel Marshall,
mm-hmm.
who helped me also with the questions.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Yes. This is Nacho, right? Who does the
Nacho
videos.
videos.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
Excellent. And the third man, I think you don't know him. He sent me this to give it to you as a present.
Oh, gosh.
It's from Sweden.
Oh, crikey. Oh, this is Max Lawrence, the guy who was in your video that you sent me. Oh, right, okay. Oh, thank you very much. So what's this then? This is because he records Bowie stuff, does he? Is that right?
He did 2 CDs.
Oh, well, gosh, that's very kind. Kiss You in the Rain, Max Lorentz sings David Bowie. Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And please thank Max very much. I shall listen to these in the car as I drive to Yorkshire later on. Thank you very much indeed. That's very kind of you. Wonderful. Thank you, Max.
Thank you for your time.
And thank you, Bernd. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, now I control if anything is on. Oh, we are short. 40 minutes? We are good.
Oh, is that good? Yeah, yeah. Oh, good.
More.
Excellent.
Wow, you're such a good talking man.
Oh, too much talking, I think. Sometimes I think, oh, shut up.
Questions to make gold out.
No, they weren't stupid questions. They were great questions. That was good. I enjoyed that. Thank you. Is that my cup of tea?
Oh, yeah.
I'm cold now. No, I enjoyed that. Thank you very much. No, I always think, oh, God, what are you talking about? Shut up. To myself, I mean. I hope that was okay.